Nau mai, haere mai, piki mai, kake mai, kia ora e tiwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We do 30 minutes with one guest and no cuts, so what we record is what you get. Peter Greste is the Australian journalist arrested in Cairo back in 2013 and imprisoned for more than a year while working for Al Jazeera. There was a biographical thriller called The Correspondent. It was released in 2024 and depicted his wrongful incarceration on a false charge of aiding the Muslim Brotherhood. The movie continues on his interrogation and his battle for freedom. Now he is a prominent media freedom advocate. He's an academic and author, serving as a professor of journalism at Macquarie University, and he's also the executive director at the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom. So with media under attack from politicians, social media companies hoovering up their revenue and falling levels of trust, how does he keep the faith? And why should you? Let's start the clock. 30 minutes with Peter Greste. Peter Greste, welcome to 30.
Great to be with you, God.
Now, just on your background, you spent, 25 years or so working for the BBC, Reuters, Al Jazeera, in some of the world's most volatile places, Afghanistan, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East. What drew you to that world? What motivated you?
Oh, gosh, I guess curiosity as much as anything else. It was... good journalism is a license to indulge your curiosity. It's a license to explore the world. And I felt when I was growing up that there was an awful lot of the world to discover. There's a big difference between exploring the world as a tourist and doing it as a correspondent. When you are a correspondent, you get to dive under the hood of a country. You get to, license to ask questions, to explore the big issues. And have a few adventures along the way. Sometimes you've got to be careful what you wish for. It was fantastic, and I loved every minute of that career.
I just wanted to set the scene in terms of motivation for journalists, and you would have met and worked alongside a lot of others who are working in correspondent or war correspondent kinds of positions. In a time where people don't trust the motivations of journalists and think they have sort of secret agendas often, what was your experience, again, of the people who were doing that job and why?
Look, there are always going to be people, I suppose, who have agendas. That's a human trait. But the best of the journalists are always arguing and debating about the best way to cover stories. I wish some of our audiences could listen in on some of the discussions that we used to have about how we unpack some of these issues, who we should be talking to, whether we've got the balance right, the degree of historical background we needed to give our audience, the context we needed to place, whether there were people that we were missing, whether we ought to be covering these stories over a period of time rather than, achieving balance over a stretch of stories rather than trying to cram everything into one. All of these things are a part of the editorial debates that we routinely have. As I said, inevitably there will be agendas. Storytelling, good journalism is a human construct after all, and stories are manufactured. Nature doesn't unfold in neat beginnings, middles, and ends. It doesn't have neat narrative arcs, and sometimes to help people understand it, we need to try and frame stories in these narratives, and that means making very specific choices about how you put a story together. But that doesn't mean that there's always a particular bias involved or a particular political agenda that people are trying to force. It's just the way that we humans tend to interpret the world.
Yes, it's interesting that you say that if people could listen in on those kinds of conversations, they'd probably walk away a lot happier with the state of the media and the motivations behind journalists. Perhaps we need to do that a bit more. Perhaps we need to lift the curtain a bit more on our processes. Do you think that might help levels of trust to some degree?
Yeah, I think it would. I mean, there's always a risk, I suppose, in exposing how the sausages are made. But by and large, I think that there is real value in giving our readers, our audiences, an understanding of what goes on in putting these stories together. And I think the digital world, the online world, gives us a lot more capacity to do that. In the old analog days, you had very, very limited airtime or space in newspapers to explain the background of this stuff. But now that we've got unlimited digital space, I think maybe there are real opportunities to explain some of the background, and some news organisations are doing that. There's a lot of talk. There are a lot of background articles and features and so on that explain how some stories are put together. I think that is a good thing, particularly, and I think around, and I suspect we may come to talk about this, around the role of AI in journalism. There is increasing levels of public skepticism, cynicism even, about AI and AI slop and the extent to which AI is used in the production of journalism. And being open and transparent about how it gets used, I think, is going to be increasingly important.
Yes, we will come to that, and we'll return to the trust factor because it really sits behind all of this. But for those who haven't seen the movie The Correspondent and your arrest and detention in Cairo, talk us through how that happened and how you ended up in prison.
Yeah, it is quite a story. I was working for Al Jazeera at the time. I was based in Nairobi, and I'd been called to Cairo at the end of 2013, December of 2013, to cover the unfolding political crisis between the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been ousted from government in a military coup about 6 months earlier, and the interim administration that had been installed in its place. It was a very, very toxic political environment. There were a lot of street protests. And so I knew that it was going to be a difficult story to cover. I didn't know Egypt very well. It was just filling in over that Christmas, New Year period while Al Jazeera was short-staffed. And so I was working with local staff to try and just basically keep the stories ticking over. And like any good journalist, we were doing what we're supposed to be doing, and that's talking to all of the parties involved in the crisis. And that included both the interim administration, but also the Muslim Brotherhood and its supporters. But around that time, the government had started accusing the Brotherhood of being involved in acts of terrorism. And so by talking to the Brotherhood, by publishing their responses to what the government was doing, in the eyes of the government, we became part of a terrorist conspiracy. There was on the night of December 28th of 2013, my hotel room was raided by a bunch of security officers from the Interior Ministry. I was arrested, and I was charged with aiding and abetting a terrorist organization, being a member of a terrorist organization, broadcasting terrorist ideology, publishing false news with intent to undermine national security, even financing terrorism. They were very, very serious charges indeed.
Yes, and you spent over 400 days in jail, as I understand it. Talk us through what the conditions were like and how you coped mentally with that.
Yeah, the conditions were, well, as you can imagine, Egypt isn't known for its benevolent prison system. It was pretty rough. There was one, I was moved around quite a few prisons. Initially, I was in one tiny police cell, about 8 foot square. If you can sort of imagine, sort of normal human being and add a couple of feet on the end of the end of them. That was it. It was an empty concrete box with no furniture, no bed, no table, no chair. But inside that 8 foot square box, there were 16 guys. It was insanely overcrowded. We couldn't all sit. You couldn't all sit down together, much less lie down. It was unbelievable. And I went from that to a period of solitary confinement, which is also its own special form of torture. The question of how I coped is a really big one, and the subject of a whole other interview, I suspect. But the short answer is that once I understood that this wasn't about me, it wasn't about anything specifically that we had done. The gap between what we were accused of, those very serious terrorism charges and the fairly mundane routine journalism that we'd been actually doing, was so vast that I couldn't really see how anybody could look at the work we'd been doing and accuse us of, and come to the conclusion that we'd actually been involved in a terrorist conspiracy. And so I realized after quite a lot of thought and reflection that this wasn't about anything we'd done. It was about what we'd come to represent. And once I understood that this was an attack on the institution of journalism and press freedom, I realized that I had to stand up for this as a on the principle rather than on my own volition. And in a way, that gave me a lot more strength, I think. I also knew that my colleagues, my professional colleagues around the world, not just in Al Jazeera, but all over the world, were lining up behind us in an incredible campaign. I don't think we've actually seen anything quite like it in any other case of a group of journalists that have been arrested. And I was only vaguely aware of just how wide that campaign was, but even the kind of snatches of information that I'd get about the extent of the campaign were hugely encouraging, and that too really kept me strong and kept me going. That and the belief that one day eventually we'd almost certainly win. I didn't know exactly when. I didn't realize how long it would take, but I was always convinced that we'd get out.
Having been jailed by an authoritarian government, you must be pretty sensitive when you see, I'm not saying an exact replica, but you're seeing those kinds of echoes in some democratic countries. You must be pretty sensitive to that, which I imagine is why you've launched this big other part of your career as a media freedom advocate.
Yeah, absolutely, Guyon. I mean, one of the reasons that I started the Alliance for Journalist Freedom here in Australia was because I recognized in reflecting on why I'd been imprisoned, I realized that our story was part of a narrative that goes back to 9/11. When George W. Bush declared the war on terror, what he did in effect was declare a war on an abstract noun, a war of ideas. And in that war of ideas, the place where ideas are transmitted becomes by definition a part of the battlefield. And I think that gave governments all over the world license to securitize the media, to treat the media as a national security priority, in a way that it hadn't been before 9/11. And it gave governments all over the world the opportunity to pass national security legislation that also covered the media, that regulated the media, that treated the media as a national security issue. Now, what happened to us in Egypt was the way in which a government had used loosely framed national security legislation, terrorism legislation, to come after uncomfortable journalism. And I could see that trend all over the world, in the United States, in the UK, in Europe, but also in my own country here in Australia. I'm not suggesting that Australia, for example, is about to become Egypt anytime soon. But the political forces and the kind of global imperatives are pushing pushed Egypt into arresting us, are also pushing Australia in a similar direction. And I think we need to remind governments everywhere that the press is not just a national security problem. The press should be treated as an ally in the security issue, that we are a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. There's always going to be a necessary tension between press freedom and national security. But when the media is doing its job, it helps the system work better. It exposes flaws in the system. It exposes abuses and overreach of government power, of political power, of institutional power. It helps develop public social cohesion. It helps the system. It helps democratic debate. It helps the entire system work much better. And so if in passing security legislation, we're undermining one of the very pillars of the system that have actually made our democracies, New Zealand's and Australia's alike, some of the most successful on earth, then in fact you're not serving national security. You're actually doing harm to the system.
Yes, and when you look to America, which has been seen as the bastion of free speech and media freedom, and you see the kinds of tactics and strategies being deployed by the Trump administration. I mean, this is a guy who nakedly calls the media the enemy of the state or the enemy of the people, who cajoles his supporters into thinking on media and journalists as enemies of America. And has taken a number of very strong steps, both physically barring mainstream media outlets from, the Pentagon or White House in some respects, to his lawsuits and defamation threats. How do you assess it when you look across at what's happening in America?
I'm deeply worried about the United States, and it's not just. I mean, you've outlined some of the steps, but he's also threatened the broadcasting licenses of some of the big broadcasters who've also been pretty critical in their coverage of the Trump administration. All of those threats are deeply problematic in what we've always regarded as the home of free speech. The US has the storied First Amendment to their constitution that guarantees freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of speech. And all of these steps are directly undermining that really essential freedom. I think it's a real problem for the United States. But I think it also, because it is undermining public debate, it is leading to a more polarized society in the United States. It is supporting what I think is starting to look very much like an authoritarian administration. But it also sends a signal to the rest of the world that those kinds of tactics are acceptable in democracies. And I think that's a real problem. That's something we really need to be pushing back on, because it's a very, very dangerous thing.
Yes, because you can see politicians in the rest of the world thinking, well, maybe this works. Maybe if I can sow the idea that you can't trust the media, then I'm going to be not held accountable. Or if I can demonize the media, there'll be a big chunk of the population who will hate the messenger anyway and stoke that along. Now, you do see echoes, even in my own country of New Zealand, you see echoes of this. I think you probably do in Australia too. I mean, how much risk do we face in this sort of catching fire?
Yeah, there is a huge risk, and let's be clear, the media isn't entirely blameless in this. There has been a decline in ethics and standards amongst the media, but this is a complicated question, and we may end up talking about this shortly. But I think that we need to recognise that the media can and should be criticised for legitimate breaches of ethics and standards, and for the way that it covers stories. There's always going to be and there should always be a lively debate about how the media operates and the role that it plays. This isn't something we should ever take for granted, and you can't sort of assume that journalists can and should be trusted. But there is a line that gets crossed where the media is targeted as a political tactic to undermine trust and confidence in the media, to undermine confidence in the work that journalists do, not because it's necessarily legitimate, but because of the way that it undermines confidence in critical reporting, when governments really do overreach, when they really are abusing their authority. And that is a really difficult problem.
I wanted to touch on freedom of speech and the cancel culture, if you like, because you withdrew recently from the Adelaide Writers' Festival after they removed a writer and academic from the program because of her views on Palestine. In your experience, is cancel culture worse on the left than the right, or are they both guilty?
Gosh, it's a big one. I think the left tends to cancel. So both are guilty. I don't want to be guilty. I don't want to sort of go into false equivalence here, though, because I think the left tends to cancel more rhetorically than anything else. I think the right tends to cancel more aggressively using legal and political means. And I think that's where we see a difference. The left complains quite vehemently and around conservative voices, but those complaints, as I said, tend to be more rhetorical than physical and actual. I'm not saying that conservative, and in anything I'm saying, I know that people will be reaching for examples to contradict my arguments, but I think it is pretty clear that statistically, the evidence shows that the left does tend to cancel rhetorically. They'll complain, they'll ignore, they'll turn off conservative voices that they don't want to hear, that they think are being unreasonable. But I think the right tends to be more aggressive in the way that they approach it through political and legal means, and that's something I'm always uncomfortable with.
What about media ownership? I mean, we are seeing a concentration of ownership. We're seeing, highly wealthy individuals like Jeff Bezos or David Ellison, who is in the process of acquiring CNN. Your own Rupert Murdoch has had a pretty successful media empire over many decades.
He's no longer ours. He's now an American
Okay, you're disavowing him, are you?
We're disavowing
He's
him,
not
yeah.
one of ours. Does media ownership matter?
Of course it does. Absolutely, it does. And I think, we can see you mentioned Jeff Bezos, and I'm also very happy to talk about Rupert Murdoch too, in the way that he's, I think, really weaponized the Fox model, which has created a right-wing community and then fed red meat to that community. But I think the Bezos example is also really interesting. He originally bought the Washington Post because he wanted to save, or he said he wanted to save, a failing legacy media brand from extinction, because it was fast disappearing. It was losing money. It was facing some very serious financial trouble, and he did a lot of good at the Washington Post. But we've recently seen some changes at the Post, which have really suggested that he's using his incredible financial power and his ownership of the Washington Post to curry favor with the Trump administration, and that is a massive problem. We also need to think about not just traditional media, legacy media, but we also need to think of social media as a part of this landscape now. I know that the social media platforms all insist that they're neutral platforms, that they simply provide a stage for the rest of us to have our conversations on. But anybody that's tracked the way in which Twitter has changed since Elon Musk bought it and converted it and renamed it, relaunched it as X, will recognize the really toxic, damaging influence, I think, of one owner can have over the algorithms that drive those platforms and the way that those algorithms shape our own conversations. You don't need to be an academic to recognize the way in which X has become much shoutier, much less pleasant, much more vitriolic place to have public conversations than it ever used to be when it was Twitter. And I think we need to recognize and understand the way that those commercial imperatives, the imperatives of their owners, and I'm not just saying Elon Musk, I think Meta, Facebook and Instagram and so on, are also vulnerable to the same kinds of commercial interests. And they have huge influence on the way that we have our own public conversations. And that worries me enormously. And I really do think we need to have a very robust argument about how we regulate those platforms and the ownership of those platforms.
Well, that's a nice segue, and I was going to ask you about this. The New Zealand experience has been, we had the Broadcasting Standards Authority. It still exists, but the government says that they're going to scrap that. And what really set that off was the idea that they might go and try and regulate some online platforms, and everyone threw up their hands at that. And the response seems to be, well, that's too hard. The technology and the industry's changed so much. Why don't we just scrap the Broadcasting Standards Authority totally? I mean, is that the answer, just to not have regulation, or?
No, absolutely not. I really think you have to have regulation. And let's be clear, there is regulation already. The social media platforms are regulated by their owners. They are the ones that design the algorithms that feed us the stories that we see. They are completely opaque to us. They are unelected. They are outside of our own statutory control. There is real questions over sovereignty on those platforms. And I think we need to understand that when we talk about regulation, in a way, we're talking about bringing regulation into a place where it's transparent. Because, as I said, it happens whether we see it or not through the way that the algorithms are designed. We also need to have guardrails, I think, in place around what counts, particularly around what counts as journalism. But there's another debate to be had about what journalism is, and I'm very happy to have that discussion as well. But if you're claiming to be producing news and information, then you have, I think, an obligation to uphold certain ethics and standards. And those are pretty uncontroversial. Those ethics and standards are the kinds of things that we expect from, and we've always expected from our news organisations. It's what we teach journalism students in countless universities around the world. It's the kind of code of conduct that you see in journalist unions and in newsrooms everywhere. But we need a mechanism to hold journalists accountable to those codes of conduct, to make sure that they are sticking to the rules, and make sure that we can give the public something to have reason to have confidence in those systems.
Well, that's right, because is that a critical component of holding the public's trust, for them to know, hey, well, there is a regulator here. They'll wrap you over the knuckles if you stuff up.
Exactly, and that regulator needs to be clear and transparent. And I think there is a useful debate to be had in New Zealand about making sure that the systems of regulation are genuinely independent of government pressure and political influence. I know that the Broadcasting Authority is a government institution. I know that there are guardrails to make sure that it operates independently. But I think scrapping it entirely and throwing your hands up and saying, well, it's all just too hard, isn't a solution. There is real value in self-regulation by the industry, but that regulation still has to be robust. The regulator has to have real teeth or capacity to genuinely sanction breaches of the code. And it's got to be transparent. The public has to be able to see it operating. But if it works, if the public has confidence, then I think it does elevate trust, not just amongst the public, but, well, it elevates trust in media itself. And so I think everybody stands to benefit from a robust system of industry regulation.
Levels of trust in media in New Zealand have been pretty woeful. I think they're sitting at around 37% at the moment. Internationally,
there is a slight uptick, I think I saw in a recent survey.
That's right. You are right, and it did uptick, which was good, but it's still well below the sort of 40% that you're seeing internationally, and even those numbers are pretty horrible. What do you think the key components of loss of trust have been, and how do we win it back?
Look, it's a massive problem, and it's a big question. A lot of commentators have said, and I agree with this to a certain extent, that journalists simply have to up their game, and that is true. But the problem is that you're asking journalists to up their game in an environment that rewards speed over accuracy, that rewards polemic over sober analysis, that rewards sensational gossip rather than serious growing-up news, the kind of stuff that people might not necessarily consume in great numbers, but that we need journalists to be producing nonetheless. And so we're never going to have the kind of journalism that we need until we're able to rethink how we fund good journalism. I think that's a really important debate, and it's not one that's popular. It's not one that we're having at the moment, that we seem to be having to the kind of extent that I think we need to. But we've got to recognise that if you expect journalism to be or journalists to be reporting in the public interest, then we've got to make sure that some public money goes into good journalism to support it. I'm not just talking about public interest or the public broadcasters, public funded media, directly public funded media like Radio New Zealand and TV New Zealand and so on. I'm talking about making sure in some way that we deliver funds to even commercial media. And the Australian government's starting to tackle this by through some mechanisms to direct funding from the big platforms to news organisations. I don't think it's perfect, but at least we're having that conversation. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And what, just finally, what gives you hope that we are going to continue to uphold the high standards of journalism that we have seen in the past? What gives you hope?
I think increasingly I'm having the conversations I'm having with the public, with people, with ordinary people and with politicians and my professional colleagues for that matter, is that there's a recognition that in the world of AI slop, in a world where it's increasingly difficult to make the distinction between what is true and what is not online, there is an increasing recognition that we have to have good journalism to underpin good public debate. Good public conversations, that the system as it is isn't working at all, but that fundamentally journalists and journalism is still and will always be a core part of the way that our democracies function. We need to have the conversation around the solutions, but there is a recognition that we're talking about finding a way of making it work rather than whether or not it should exist at all.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. We really appreciate your time on 30.
It's been great, Guy.
That is 30 Minutes with Peter Grester. This is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We'll catch you next time. Ka kite.